Hello, and welcome to the Politics and Letters podcast. I'm David Barfield with Jim Livingston. Today, our guest will be speaking with Professor Gordon Lafer, who is the co-director of the Labor Education and Research Center at the University of Oregon. He is also a research associate with the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow with the National Education Policy Center. Lafer holds a PhD in political science from Yale University and is founding co-chair of the American Political Science Association's Labor Project. He has written widely on labor and education policy and has served as an organizer and strategic planner for several labor unions, including unions representing hotel workers, nurses, school teachers, university employees, and construction workers. At the start of the Obama administration, Lafer served as senior policy advisor for the U.S. Congress's Committee on Education and Labor. From 2019 to 2023, he was an elected member of the School District Board of Directors for a 16,000 student school district in Eugene, Oregon. With that, Gordon, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
We're going to be talking about an article or piece in the Economic Policy Institute's website, which Gordon sent me and Jim. It's called Fear at Work, an inside account of how employers threaten, intimidate, and harass workers to stop them from exercising their right to collective bargaining. We're going to ask some specific questions about this problem, I guess we can call it. And Gordon, in the piece, you mentioned the PRO Act that was passed in Congress back in 2020 in February. And I guess it is floating around someplace at this point. Can you talk a little bit about where that is, what its status is, and its possibilities for its passage or what? And then I guess a follow-up to that.
Sure. So the PRO Act, and PRO stands for Protecting the Right to Organize, is the latest attempt to try to make the right to organize real. By the latest polling, there's something like close to 60 million American workers who do not have a union, who say they wish they had a union in their workplace and would vote for one if given a chance. But only less than 50,000 people, which is way less than 1% of that number, actually get a new union each year through the current system under federal labor law. So the PRO Act is an attempt to make it easier, to make the system more democratic and make it easier and less intimidating for people who want a union to be able to have that wish come true. And it was passed at the U.S. House of Representatives when the House was had a Democratic majority. It was dead on arrival in the Senate. And I think, one of the things we see is that if you think about, people argue, oh, what's the most central form of oppression or control in our society? Is it the family? Is it gender? Is it capitalism? Is it whatever? One way to look at that is to look at what is the thing that is most important to the most powerful forces in American politics. And those forces are the big corporate lobbies, which are much bigger than either of the political parties. And historically, the thing that there has been the fiercest opposition and the most money put into opposing by those big corporate lobbies is labor law reform. That was true in 1978, the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Bill. It was true under Clinton when Clinton tried to reform labor law. The most recent attempt before the PRO Act was something called the Employee Free Choice Act that was at the start of the Obama administration, 2009, 2010, and now the PRO Act. So there's no question that to get anything through would require 60 votes in the Senate, which is hard to get. Democrats hardly ever have 60 votes. And the Democrats are not God's gift to working people either. There are conservative Democrats who wouldn't necessarily, it's not even so much a question of be in favor of it in their heart of hearts, but support it strongly enough that they would stand up against tremendous pressure from donors to go against it, that I think would come not only from traditionally Republican sources of money, but from Democratic money as well.
Right. Just a kind of follow-up to that, though, I have read that there, and in your piece you allude to this, or state it specifically actually, that unions are not looked at by a lot of people as evil things. People want them, as you mentioned, or some people do. It seems to me that it might be an argument to make, right, in an election. Do you think that Biden would use it as even cynically, maybe as a tool to get elected, or is he where at in terms of its selling?
I don't think so. Biden has done. There's a lot to criticize. Biden has done some very important good things for unions. The single most important is his appointments to the labor board, and especially Jennifer Abruzzo, who was the general counsel for the Communication Workers Union, and Biden appointed as general counsel for the National Labor Relations Board. She has done a lot of things that without relying on passing legislation in Congress, tried to make elections fair. For instance, one of the reasons that so many Starbucks have been able to organize is that she ruled that Starbucks had to let people vote by mail or by secure app on cell phone or something, as opposed to in the workplace. Because normally union election means you're voting in your workplace, your managers are harassing you all day long. It's like we wouldn't allow an election for a city council to take place in the Democratic Party headquarters or in the Republican Party headquarters, because it would be undue influence. So she's had a tremendous impact, very important impact. She also she ruled in ways that were very helpful to the Amazon organizing in Staten Island, New York, and some other things. So that's been important. He's also put in very serious incentives for union recognition, or at least having employers not oppose unions in the money for building electric cars and other kind of manufacturing and transition to clean energy economy. But I think, you always have to think, people say, I'd like to have a union. And that's like polling that happens before you have all of the anti-union communication, millions and millions of dollars of communication by corporate lobbies, which says, unions are just blood-sucking leeches who are going to steal dues money and give you nothing. They're going to make you go on strike and lose your job. And before everybody gets the communication from their personal manager that they should be anti-union. So I think it's a hard thing to run on in that way. I also think, both parties have tension or contradictions between their money and their base. On the Democratic side, a lot of Democratic money comes from Wall Street, comes from Hollywood, comes from the tech industry. And those are all places that are pretty liberal on social issues, and up to a point on labor issues. Like, they're okay with raising the minimum wage, but they oppose real labor law reform, I think, probably as much as Republican donors in other industries do. So for all those reasons, I would not expect this to be something that Biden campaigns on. It's not something that Obama campaigned on when he supported labor law reform, but in a very inside baseball way. Unfortunately, no.
Yeah. Can I follow up here? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I found your Economic Policy Institute piece fascinating and fortifying, but also depressing as hell. So let me follow up here a little bit by pushing us either forward from the law or backward from the law, and talking about the ideological situation, the intellectual climate, if you will. So, I mean, in your piece, you cite 49% of workers, on the job are perfectly open to a union. This is what David was talking about, I think, at the outset. But the Pew polling is even more startling. It shows 70% of the American public is in favor of unions. They view unions favorably. Okay. So we've got this ideological climate, if you will, in which unions seem to be perfectly a perfectly natural part of the social landscape, according to overwhelming majority of the American people. And yet, we have this it's not even a log jam in Congress. There, as you point out, there's no possibility this could become law, the right to organize as you're proposing it here. Okay, so all right, how come? I mean, there's this disconnect between the ideological framework within which we're all operating and the legal possibilities, the possibilities of making law. So is it what we remember about big labor from the 1960s when people my age at least were up against George Meany and the AFL-CIO and its support of what we used to call imperialism? Is it the left itself which came out, it seems to me, in that moment, in the late 60s and 70s, as extremely anti-union, in part because, unions were accused rightly of being discriminatory in all kinds of ways against women, against minorities, and so forth. Anyway, what I'm suggesting is that don't we have to rectify? See, this is my confusion. We don't have to rectify the ideological situation. We're already there, and yet, this rule by the tiny sliver of the people we call capital can rule in this way. How do you suppose that works?
Well, at the risk of seeming too crude or like a simpleton or something, it's all money. The people who serve in Congress and in many other places are, their elections are dependent on raising millions of dollars that come overwhelmingly from wealthy people and big corporations. That's gotten even more extremely true in the dozen years since Citizens United allowed unlimited and largely untraceable corporate spending on politics. And there's so the corporations spend money on campaigns. They run their own independent ads. They run their own independent voter contacts. They promise people jobs or blacklist people from getting high-paying jobs when they leave elected office. It's very, very powerful. And labor law is not the only thing. You can find lots of examples. I think that there's majority support for having universal right to paid sick leave, to a certain number of days of paid sick leave. Majority support among Republicans as well as Democrats. There's probably majority support for immediately raising the minimum wage to, if not 15, at least 12, and indexing it to inflation. Even higher percentages than the pro-union percentage. And those things are just as much DOA. They're not DOA because of some failure in the national ideology or national social conversation. It's just, you can't think of politics as if here's what the population thinks, and then that gets translated into laws, because in between what the population thinks and the laws that come out is this other mechanism that works according to a very different logic and is not very accountable to public opinion.
Yeah.
Assault weapons are another. I mean, there's all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Well, Medicare for all.
Yeah, that great example. Yes.
Yeah. Well, okay, then David, did you want to go ahead? Go ahead.
I'll go. I'll bring it up later.
Okay. So I guess this does really bring me to this, the idea of how to address the problem that you raised so poignantly here, and that is the asymmetry at the law is pretty obvious. The common law has its roots in the protection and the definition of property, and that seems pretty plain. Capital is property, but labor, the capacity that all of us have to produce value through work. Marx said, once workers know that is, this alienable commodity, that's the beginning of capitalism. Okay. What is it about us, that is to say, people on the left, can't make the move to say, okay, well, look, we define capital as property, and we want to protect property. And we say that if labor removes itself from the process of production, we have to protect the right of property by protecting the prospect of income from the use of the property that we call capital. Why can't we invert that specification and say, okay, well, we have a right to the property in ourselves and our capacity to produce value. We want to protect that, the expectation of income from the use of that property. So you can't leave this town and relocate in wherever, because what you're doing is ruining our expectation of income, a reasonable expectation, because it's our property. Is that something that we might be able to, I don't know, propose, suggest, articulate?
I think that, there's, you're touching on something where like multiple problems connect with each other, right? One is how clear or how radical an understanding of the economy do most people have, right? Or let's say an ideological or educational issue.
Yeah.
And then a second is, how much does that matter, or how much is politics controlled by forces that make that not matter? And then how do you, if those are the political forces that working people are up against, if that's the hand we're dealt, right? How do you organize people enough to overcome that, right? And in some ways, those things can be connected. I don't feel like I have the answer. When I left DC, when I was working in Congress and I left, and you need to write a book. As like everybody knows, the structure of that book is basically all the books are what's so broken about Washington and how to fix it. And I felt like I could write the first half of that book. I have no idea what the second half is, right? And if I knew, I would have written it, or I'd be giving different lectures. But one of the most hopeful things that I have, and I don't mean to be Pollyannish about it, is in states where you can run ballot initiatives, where people can get involved in elections that are about issues as opposed to about candidates or parties.
Right.
There's very broad bipartisan support for progressive things. I mean, even if you look at, when Arizona voted for Trump, and in the same election voted a significant increase in minimum wage and to establish a right to paid sick leave. And when you do the math, there had to have been at least several 100,000 people who both voted for Trump and voted to, which we know a lot of Trump's base is that's what economic populism is, right?
Wow.
And there's certainly, if you take the situation that you said, I think almost nobody puts it in terms of Marxist theory or theories of property, but people will say, if we give tax breaks and free electricity and free infrastructure and grading of the land to this company because they say we promise we're going to create 1,000 family wage jobs for 10 years, and then they don't, shouldn't they have to pay that back? I would bet something like that probably polls 80% support, right? Without the theoretical underpinning.
Yeah.
At the same time, as somebody who does, I work in a labor education center. We haven't done this. I feel like I would like to be teaching something that's a little more like what labor education looked like in the 20s or 30s, including basic labor theory of value. Because I think most people, even strong kind of radical union members, think, well, the rich people and company owners who own property, they own it. They legitimately own it. But it's morally unfair that they keep it all for themselves and don't share it with us. And that's not it's a very radical idea, but it's not a very complicated idea. It's not an idea that people can't get. And I think, 100 years ago or 90 years ago. So maybe if we had, when you think, all right, well, what piece do we need to do by brute political power? What piece do we need to do by education? What piece do we just, start drinking now? It's hopeless. And but so
okay, that's me.
We've all been there. So sometimes I think about that as a direction we could go in, because I think a lot of people could get that. That's an understandable thing. And maybe that would make more people less easily diverted or confused by the corporate propaganda.
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say, we were just a couple of years ago, or maybe more than a couple of years ago, in 15 and 16, we were and 20, we were handed a blueprint, I think, by Bernie Sanders. This has just been my argument. I think this has been the strongest political argument that I've seen. I think you've alluded to it in some of what you were saying before, is that no matter what, you need a strong political party or an apparatus within a party or something that's going to push this stuff. And how is it that you bring people into, now I just sound like one of the memes that I see on the social media sites that I go to. And it almost sounds corny to say, but it really, I don't see any other avenue for this besides making certain arguments that seem just and fair, right? That seems like the most powerful, like you said, in Arizona, right? People voted for minimum wage not because they feel like 17 an hour is going to make people's lives that radically different, but it's also a question of just fairness, right? Anyway, that I just wanted to put my plug in for that idea that parties need to be, and you talk about teaching, or Jim brought up this idea about like educating people who are not necessarily on your side, that they will start thinking in terms of perhaps fairness or perhaps whatever positive ideas get us there. If that makes sense.
Well, that was Gordon's point, I thought, and it's a great one. So if I may ask, I mean, I'm retired now, so I don't know what's going on in the university. So maybe Gordon, you could talk a little bit about, what are the prospects of this kind of education? I don't think we can make our way back to the labor education projects of the early 20th century or even the 20s and 30s. But, is the university robust enough to accommodate this kind of teaching, pedagogy, ideological work, if you will?
Mostly, I would say no. Universities are more and more kind of neoliberal corporate model organizations.
Yeah.
But labor education, I do think we're in this we're in an interesting time and interesting labor market, right? And part of the downward mobility of the last 40 years is that you have people, not all college educated, but including college educated people who are in jobs like Starbucks jobs into their mid-late 20s, right? Jobs that used to be, I'll do it for a summer or whatever, which is, I think, one of the things that has sparked the organizing is that jobs that didn't used to matter to people and where people didn't used to stick around long enough to get to know each other well enough to organize, that's changed. And, in the people who I talk to, there's lots of different things going on, but there's a strain, like there's always been we should do this through mutual aid and self-help and, local small scale cooperative economics, which the long debate over should you be the change you want to see, or is that actually dropping out of the fight and failing to really confront power? But, part of the problem with the party, talking about when we live now instead of 100 years ago, where there is nobody who feels that kind of allegiance to left parties like they used to, and that just the reality is so different. I think you were 100% right about the Sanders campaign, David, but he's it's very hard to figure out how to produce another Bernie Sanders, right? Partly him, where he came from, his personal kind of style and charisma and straightforwardness, but also that he came up in Vermont, which is a place where you could plausibly, like the retail politics of just knowing, 1,000 business owners across the state of Vermont might be able to trump the power of corporate spending, right? Because you're not just reliant on money and advertising in big media markets. It's such a small population place that somebody like him could come up and triumph over that, which is kind of unimaginable in California or New York or even Oregon. So it's hard to imagine. And so then you kind of feel like, all right, should we be basing it on a party, or do we, to me, the other ways is to have fights around ballot initiatives and use those not only as things to win, but as vehicles for education. Because, you can knock on people's doors when you're not saying, vote for so-and-so because, they like kids or they're really nice or whatever, but you're saying, here's why we need everybody to vote for minimum wage or vote for healthcare for all at the state level or something like that, is an opportunity for political education that you don't have in normal electoral politics. Or organizing workplaces themselves, which also not for most people, but for the people who are centrally involved in first time of organizing a union, can itself be very intense and a very intense political education, because most people start off wanting to believe the best about their boss, and they think, oh, well, why don't we just sit down with them? Why don't we have a joint committee? Why don't we write them a letter? Why don't we do a study, right? And it takes doing all these things and having your boss say, like, get out of my face, I don't care about, take your data and go home or whatever, for people to get radicalized about how does power work. So like, this is where I don't know what the answer is, and it's not like we have to choose only one of these, but I think if we think of the idea of a party or a political movement, but that can sustain itself beyond one charismatic moment of mobilization like Occupy or the Sanders campaign, then we have to think, all right, how do we actually build an organization that lasts? And in a lot of ways, either ballot initiative campaigns or workplace organizing are maybe better vehicles for building lasting organizations. But there's none of them. I don't think there's anybody in the labor movement who can say, here's my 7-point plan for victory, and if everybody would just do what I say, then we'll be in good shape. Some people say it, but I haven't heard a credible version.
Right. Well, David, you got something there? Because I'd like to zoom out for a minute.
Zoom out? You got to take.
No, I don't. I mean, like, get all macro on us.
Go macro.
Yeah. I mean this, Gordon. I was going to shift gears and ask you about, you're a labor, something of a labor historian, and certainly an analyst of the current situation of the labor market. So what do you think is going on? I mean, I wrote a book called "Fuck Work." At least that was the French translation, and I was of the opinion then, it was published in 2016, that, work was, rapidly fading, diminishing in its importance in establishing, at least in people's minds, the notion of character and so forth. Occupy had something to do with that, and so did the great financial crisis of 2007 through 9. So what do you, and I also thought that the Great Resignation was a real thing, that it looked to me like a general strike there for a while. And I'm not so sure about that anymore. So I wonder if you could just make some, reasoned conjectures about what do you think is going on in the labor market these days, and where do you think it's headed?
Okay. Well, let me first kind of go even further macro than that, and then I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
So the further macro to that is like, the rise of right-wing nationalist populism across the world. And, we've seen, like, there are certain moments in time when political regimes have changed in, like, all of the industrial countries. In the 20s, 30s, 40s was either some countries went to fascism, and for everybody else, that was the rise of social democracy, including here, which didn't go as far as any other country, but like that's when we had the New Deal, right? And then that lasted till sometime in the 70s, early 80s, when in almost all of those places, some form of neoliberalism came in. I would say that what we're seeing now is like the exhaustion of neoliberalism, which is to say, it can no longer provide enough economically for people to get a majority or even a plurality of people to buy into the legitimacy of that kind of system. And so we've seen things more to the left than had been viable before, which I would include Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and Syriza in Greece, and the Podemos thing in Spain. Yeah. And then mostly the triumph of things much further to the right. And so in every country where this is happening, people tend to explain it with explanations that are only about that country, right? So in America, a lot of people say, oh, to understand Trump, you need to understand like that we've never really dealt with the legacy of slavery and white supremacy. And in Germany, they say, oh, well, the right rose because we took in 1 million refugees from Syria and Afghanistan. But then they can't explain Hungary or Poland, who took in 0 refugees and have the same.
Right.
They certainly can't explain Modi or what's his name, Duterte in Philippines, right? So, or Netanyahu. I spent a lot of time in Israel. People say, "Oh, this is what you need to understand about Netanyahu," and it's all about domestic factors, Palestine, religion, whatever. You can't see the same phenomenon happening in 12 different countries and have an explanation that is only about your country. But so that's figuring out, okay, what is that thing, right? And I don't totally know, but I feel like it has to do with the exhaustion of neoliberalism, the kind of slow but steady decline of the middle class, or of what the slow but steady decline of regular people's ability to secure a secure standard of living, like not to get rich, but to have a place to live, to have health insurance, to not worry about being poor and desperate when you're old, to be able to help your kids get on their feet in some way, like just to be okay, to be secure, has gotten more and more out of reach for more people. And that creates, all kinds of, that creates rage and insecurity and resentment. And, I know people, I know some union members who will say, like, I hate Wall Street, I hate insurance companies, I hate doctors and lawyers, and I hate immigrants, and I hate people on welfare. A lot of hate to go around. And our side is saying, steer that energy towards the Koch brothers, and their side is saying, steer that energy towards immigrants and gay people. And so there's, I think we're in this time of a politics that's kind of combustible and chaotic, which is why somebody like Sanders can attract a big following. Somebody like Trump can attract a big following. But all of the neoliberal candidates, okay, Biden won. It's like, wouldn't say not neoliberal candidate can't win anymore, but you're squeaking through, right? And on the Republican side, everybody who's the neoliberal types that the corporate lobbies really wanted, Jeb Bush and Rubio, and like all those guys are like, they can't get any traction because they can't say anything that feels like it resonates with the level of rage or insecurity or something that people feel. So, okay, so to me, that's a big picture, and we can't not think, you just can't not see this happening across the world and say, all right, well, we're not going to think about that. I just want to think about America or, Eugene, Oregon or something. But then, to your thing of what's happening in the labor market, and again, it's a little hard to know how much is the temporary moment that we're in, which is a very tight labor market, right? So part of, I think another thing that made the Starbucks organizing possible is that the normal fear of being fired wasn't really effective, because you can get fired from Starbucks and get another job that pays as well, very easily. And that's probably not going to be true forever. It's been true for a while. I do also think that the both the pandemic, you said the Great Resignation, I actually don't know how everybody who's not working is getting by, but there's a lot fewer people working. I think there are a lot of people. One of the things that happened during the pandemic is people realized how much they don't like having a boss. And, those people who were able to work remotely, we all talk about, oh, you don't have to commute and you can blah, blah, blah. And all that stuff is true, but it's also true that nobody's over your shoulder. And there's some way that the technology allows you to be treated like an adult, which is get your work done. But as long as you're getting your work done, you don't have to put in FaceTime for the sake of it. You don't have to have all these like fake smiley conversations where you pretend to respect supervisors you don't really respect, all that stuff.
You're right.
So and then I think that there's I work a little bit with college age students, and so I don't have any data, and I could be totally wrong. And of course, the people I work with are self-selected to be leftists and pro-union and stuff like that. But I feel like there's a slightly broader, maybe this is only college educated people who just are disillusioned, who feel like there's no chance that they're going to be able to have a family that lives the way they grew up. They don't believe their employers really care about them. They don't see a kind of a clear career track. I mean, with some exceptions, I'm talking about like, University of Oregon. It's not like going to, an Ivy League school and then you go to Wall Street. Okay, there are those people. But, it's like the flagship school in a not very rich state. And there are people who go on to be lawyers and doctors and all that. But there's also a fair number of people who work the same jobs after they get their college degree as they did working their way through college. They're an assistant manager in a supermarket or something like that. And I think that disillusionment, which partly shows up with,
Yeah, I agree. Wow. Yeah, I wish I could explain the labor market too. I used to think I could, and I just given up. Yeah.
I wanted to back up for a second, just to something you said, Gordon, about right-wing populism. Is there, in your view, just generally, or maybe more specifically to this conversation, is there something? Is populism a right-wing phenomenon? Do you look at it that way, or is there some other motivating because I wanted to ask you about conservative. I've always sort of thought about this, and there's plenty of conservatives in labor unions, right?
Well,
and what do you think? What's your sense of their kind of like motivating factor? We know it's not Marx, and it may not even be justice. Maybe it's totally self-interest or buy American, possibly, or other sort of more particular or less, democratic ideals. Am I making too much of the definition, or is there something there that you see as a connection?
well, I guess let me talk about right-wing populism and then talk about conservative union members, if that's okay.
Yep.
And, people can use whatever words they want. I mean, almost. But if people want to argue about should it be called populism or should it be something else, but certainly, like, if you look at Trump now, Trump tends to say a lot of diametrically opposed things. Like, he'll make claims on both sides of an issue, so it's hard to say Trump is for this. But among the things that he's talked about, Trump has campaigned saying he wants to close the carried interest loophole for Wall Street. Basically wants to make people on Wall Street pay more taxes. He said we should never cut Social Security. He said we have to negotiate drug prices down, but the drug companies are gouging us and the drug prices should be much less. He's talked about raising taxes on corporate executives and doing away with Wall Street bonuses. Now, in his case, I don't think he means any of those things. Like, and when he was in office, the only ways in which he was kind of on the side of working people was when it was being against foreign workers. So he was actually, he killed the Trans-Pacific Partnership that I believe Hillary would have approved, which was like a NAFTA deal for all the Pacific Rim countries. That, to me, that genuinely was a economically progressive thing to do. But other than that, right, it's all anti-immigrant, anti-foreign, whatever. And even that stuff he doesn't really mean. And he certainly didn't do, he moved to cut taxes on rich people and corporations, not to raise them. But he talks like that, right? And I think when we, God, there's so much to say about this. But for instance, like, the whole argument about fake news, which obviously, is real and is a terrible, serious problem. But I also think, like, okay, all of the mainstream liberal news, Times, the Post, the whatever, from when NAFTA started, for 20 years, has been telling people, you think that free trade is making jobs disappear and making your life worse, but that's actually just because you're too dumb to really understand that it's really helping you, right? And that is as much fake news as anything. Like, not to mention the New York Times being sure that there was proof of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and other stuff like that. Like, it's not just the Trump people. And when working people say, oh, the organs of elite liberal society, or even when we talk about, the sanctity of the court system, I think for anybody who is not wealthy and has experience with the court system, it's of a completely corrupt, stacked system. And so it's not surprising that there would be, and it's not illegitimate that there would be anger in that direction. And then what I think of as right-wing populism is something that combines that kind of justified anger and talks a game about economic populism, and in reality wants to substitute that kind of culture war populism that doesn't materially change anybody's life while continuing to make the rich richer. It seems to me like that's him, that's Berlusconi, that's Orban, that's a bunch of other people. So in that way, I think there is a thing. It's different from George W. Bush, say, or Jeb Bush, right? They wouldn't say any of those things, and they were more clearly comfortable and part of the liberal coastal cultural elite. So that's one thing. On the union side, I mean, there's not strong numbers, but everybody I know thinks probably 40% of union members voted for Trump. And within that, like within the country as a whole, there are people who just are Republicans and would have voted for any Republican. There are people who are, Proud Boys and QAnon people. There's a wide range of things there. I know a whole union full of steelworkers who all supported Bernie in the primary in 2016, and then when they couldn't vote for Bernie, voted for Trump because they thought Hillary was going to pass free trade agreements that would hurt them, and they were right.
Yeah.
But I guess the key thing that I think is a mistake on the left, and particularly to the extent it happens in the labor movement, is writing all those people off and saying all these people are racist assholes and therefore we shouldn't be talking to them. We should just be demonizing them and telling them how corrupt their souls are. Because I think there's very few places that have an institutional interest or ability to reach those people in any kind of political conversation. Unions have the self-interest and have some ability. I mean, most of those people don't come to union meetings, but still, we have their names, we know where they live, like there's a way to talk to them. And, there are people who are progressive just on their own contract. But if you start where people are at and say, okay, here we are, and we need to protect undocumented workers in this industry, because if we don't, that's who everybody's just going to hire them, and we're all going to, and wages are going to be driven down, even just for self-interested reasons, right? Not many people adopt a politics that is purely against their self-interest.
Right.
But I think that there are ways, and I would like to see labor unions put more effort into this. And honestly, if 15% of those people change their minds, that would change national politics. It's not like you need to convince 100% of the people.
Yeah, I think about these disagreements just with respect to the left. I mean, think about how many people you would not think, and that you would never characterize them in any other ways than on the left, and you disagree with them on any number of issues. People on our side, right, that all voted for Bernie.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of disagreements.
Yeah. But that, Gordon, the argument you just made about these enraged populists who drift or choose rationally on rational grounds to vote for Trump because he's against the Pacific Agreement, that's the best argument I've heard so far, not to write these people off, not to dismiss them, because, the circles I travel in over here on the East Coast, yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to convince anybody we should be trying to speak to those people, and it's hard to convince myself, I got to say, because, I've known a few, but not very many. You know many, many more because you're engaged with the union movement. So, yeah, it's a great argument.
This is, at the core of union organizing is a belief that people change, because, unlike most other organizations on the left, a union is not a vanguard organization. You need active support from a strong majority of people who are not Marxist Leninists. It's like, okay, here's a supermarket and there's 400 people who work there, and they're just normal, apolitical, run-of-the-mill people, and you have to get them to the point where they're going to go on strike, or they're going to get arrested blocking traffic, or they're going to do something that is strong enough to make their boss do something they don't otherwise want to do. And that is you cannot do that and be purist and say, oh, these people are assholes and these people are racist and these people, like, it's a dance always of like holding the right line. And I also think part of that organizing is always organizing where there's a vision of justice that coincides with people's self-interest. a lot of the left, I mean, I would say a lot of what calls itself the left now, first of all, does not organize like that at all. And this was when I said people can use words however they want. Some of the exceptions that I hate is people who say they're organizers who all they do is talk and post shit online. Like they're like, okay, fine, you can use the word, but that's
Right.
not, it's like a pun. It means something different than what it means in the context of labor organizing or tenant organizing, where you actually have to get a strong majority of people to agree to do something hard. And so I think people don't do that. And on the contrary, everybody wants to be, the great and glorious loud voice or whatever. A million people have made this critique of social media. But if you say everybody who voted for Trump is verboten, we're not going to talk to them, then just say, like, I never want to have power. I want to be part of a
Yes.
minority of people who can congratulate ourselves on our purity and hope that we have enough money to hide away wherever we are until the black shirts come to get us.
Yes.
Not just that, like your guys who supported Bernie in the primary, but a big chunk of those Trump guys were Obama voters.
Yes.
Yeah.
It didn't take them much to switch over.
Right. This is what I think is, the parts of the I mean, obviously there's a lot that's good and important about all the anti-racist organizing, but the strain of it that basically says, America is unchanged since 1619 or since right, and that has an ahistorical, what you're seeing now is the deep-seated thing that never really changed, and therefore can't explain how somebody could have voted for Obama and then voted for Trump.
Yes.
All means you have no strategy for trying to reverse that, right? You've got,
Yes.
and to me, like that may be a strategy for selling books or getting rich off high speaking fees, but it's not a political organizing strategy.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you for that. I just had this argument on Friday night with two very learned people about 1619, and yeah. All right.
Well, I'm glad something has changed since 1619. I'll tell you. Would never well in that kind of culture. I doubt any of us. Well, that gets it. I was curious about that. It seems like, and then just in raw numbers, right? I mean, the people who are out there, this country is, I don't know, people like to say it's a liberal country, or it's a pretty kind of a conservative country, isn't it? Generally, or it really is half and half, which means you need, like you say, 5% or 8% of the. So you better.
Yeah. I mean, I think every country is basically conservative because people, I mean, in our time, certainly change has meant excitement to begin with, but then devolution very quickly follows. So, I mean,
you have to look at, like, I think, let's say about something like climate change, right? And I work on some from a labor point of view, right? So a lot of the construction unions are ambivalent, or, like, want to build the pipelines and all that kind of stuff. And people on the progressive side sometimes say, those people are so selfish, they're destroying the planet, don't they want their children to blah, blah, blah. And I think, yeah. And I also think, like, if somehow the way climate change worked was that the solution to climate change involved 80% of professors losing their jobs, that we would have a lot of academics saying, the science isn't totally clear. It's just like, okay, you can't say, like, all the, graphic artists in Brooklyn are going to be pro-climate because somebody else is going to pay the price by having them and their kids be unemployed.
You're making me feel bad, Gordon. I don't know, man.
Sorry.
No, I'm glad I'm retired. Believe me. Oh my God.
That's his job. Well, Jim,
All right.
I think we've
I'm good. I think that's a very good place to end.
done our hour-ish. And, well, Gordon, it has been a pleasure seeing you. And
And
a pleasure meeting you, Gordon.
yeah, you too. I have to go read your book now.
But I've changed my mind. So
wait a minute, the Fuck Work book, that was the French translation? Or
yeah. The English title, they wouldn't let me use. I mean, the working title for, however many years I was writing, it was Fuck Work. And then at the last minute, they said, no, we can't use that title because Amazon won't list it. And then if Amazon doesn't list it, you're fucked. And I said, oh, come on, And then sure enough, we changed the title to No More Work, which is, about as anodyne as you can get. And then within 2 weeks, I saw 3 titles on Amazon with the F word as the first word in the title of the goddamn book. So who knows what happened?
Fuck, comma work. Maybe that would have been.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we'll see. Oh,
now, do you need 5 seconds of silence now to close things out?
Well,
this is the French translation.
That's great. Yeah, we can. We'll do our 5 seconds now, and we'll see you later.
Okay, great. It's good seeing you.
Seeing you.